For Richard Kirwan, there are two ways to start a good day. A sunrise over his home city of Waterford, and tucking his trouser legs into his socks. Richard is retired now, but there's actually a connection between his daily cycles around Waterford and his old job. He was an engineer, in charge of the Ordnance Survey. However, in retirement, Richard is now doing something you wouldn't expect an engineer to do. Richard grew up in this house in Cannon Street in Waterford. Across the street is what he calls an omen to his future career. This is a benchmark placed by mapmakers in the 1800s. And in his childhood bedroom was another omen.
I remember going through one of the presses in my bedroom, and I found a coloured map of Waterford and the surrounding areas. And I became fascinated because it showed the city as I had never seen it. It showed it obviously almost from the air. You see the hashing on the hills. It was a very attractive map. It was almost artistic.
To most of us, this map is made of paper. But for Richard, it has more than two dimensions. It sparks his senses.
And go right across towards Powers and Knox.
The sounds and feel of his childhood Sundays. Because every week, Richard would be brought out into the countryside on the bar of a bike by the two most important men in his life, his father and grandfather. The trio used to stop at places like the Knockeen Dolmen, just outside the city.
Just wander in and explore the monument.
And were you not bored as a young fellow going out with the two older men?
No, because they'd be sort of nattering away to themselves about various people that lived there, and I'd be listening in and enjoying it.
And was there a treat at all at the end of the day, or was...
Well, yeah, probably with my grandfather there was probably threepence somewhere along the line, you know. Obviously there weren't too many shops around at the time, but at the end of the time there would always be something from my grandfather's pocket.
The soundtrack of the cycles also included stories. Here at Sporthouse, Richard's grandfather told him about how, when he was a child, he came across a lonely funeral. Just two men carrying a coffin.
The men were carrying the coffin of what would have been known at the time as a land grabber. People had been evicted from their land and this person had taken it over. And when he died, nobody would handle his body or the coffin.
When he left school, Richard became an engineer and joined the Ordnance Survey, which at the time was run by the military. Mapping in those days had changed little since the 1800s. Teams had to travel the countryside making measurements. Mountains had to be climbed. Rivers had to be followed. Ditches had to be jumped. It was a great way for a young man to get to know Ireland. Of course, in the 1970s, it was pre-computers, pre-satellite, pre-Google Maps.
We used to have to carry 12-volt batteries up mountains, you know. And these were heavy-duty lorry batteries, not car batteries. So, you know, there were the hardships there, but they were sort of enjoyable hardships, maybe not enjoyable on the day.
Map making suited Richard's ordered personality. A map fixed the landscape in time, with rigour and precision. And in the beginning, that's what Richard thought map making was all about. But like his childhood days out with his father and grandfather, he discovered that map making came with a soundtrack. Stories. In order to take measurements, Ordnance Survey staff had to go into farmhouses to get permission to access the land. Richard would take with them old maps of the area, and as soon as he opened them out on the farmhouse kitchen table, the talk would start.
They might start naming the fields that were around them, and you know, say, oh yeah, look, there's the Haggard field there, or you know, there's the field with the big tree. It was almost as if these fields had disappeared for generations, and suddenly they were appearing back to them again, because there was always an air of excitement. when they would look and say, oh yeah, there's the Haggard field. Yeah, as if it shouldn't be there. Once they got the bearings, you could just stay quiet, say nothing, and they would be off, and you could just listen and listen and listen.
Another stop on the Sunday cycles, the cemetery at Risk near Waterford City. This graveyard used to be a hideout during the War of Independence. One Sunday, Richard's grandfather told Richard how his great-grandmother used to visit this spot.
His mother had been a runner for the IRA in the 1920s. She used to go on an Aston cart to pay the men on the run. And, if the British Army or the Black and Tans, whoever were there at the time, would stop her, she was a woman coming home from the market with something in her basket.
Richard's time in the Ordnance Survey coincided with the arrival of aerial photography and computerisation. The maps were more precise, but not as beautiful. Although what happened in his childhood pointed to a job in the Ordnance Survey, for Richard, once he was there, his childhood was obviously left far behind, until one day a childhood memory came back and caused him to break down.
I was pretty stressed, let's say. I couldn't see it, but I'm sure they saw it at home as well.
He was in charge of the Ordnance Survey and had been working hard pushing through new projects.
At that time I wasn't taking holidays.
He was sent on a training course that included a session of hypnosis.
And when I was in a trance, something happened, because when I came out of that trance, that hypnosis trance, I just felt that things had changed totally. And I began to wonder, about the life I was living, whether in fact, it was all work and no play. I was very, very, very emotional. I think one of the things that came up for me was the whole issue of my own father's death. Because as you can gather from, talking to you, I was quite attached to my father. And he died when I was 13, died suddenly. And I never cried when my father died. And I remember the night he died, he was out and he never came back. And I heard a commotion downstairs, probably I was still awake, I wasn't a great sleeper. And next minute there was a knock on my bedroom door and an aunt came in. And she told me, sat in the bed and said, your father's dead. And she said, you're the man of the house, you can't cry. And I didn't cry. And I remember, all through the funeral and everything else, just being there, not crying, just being the man of the house, being the brave man. And I think, I held all of that in until that moment.
Eventually, Richard decided that work was taking up too much of his life. He explored other paths and discovered that he was interested in healing. His hands that used to follow the lines of a map now follow the lines of energy in someone's body. But you're an engineer, so how do you make sense of something like Reiki healing?
I don't anymore. Whereas I can see the logic of making maps. This is just an intuitive thing. A number of years ago, I certainly would have absolutely scoffed at it. Something in me said, let it happen. And I let it happen. And as I say, I don't make any claims. I don't practice, an awful lot. I practice on family and friends and people that want to do that. But I make no claims and I never try to explain it.
As well as Reiki healing, Richard studied creative writing. Cycling is still in the family. Richard is married with 6 children and his sons cycle. As Richard cycles the Sunday routes taken by his father and grandfather, he is now the older man on the bike with the stories.
Approximately here, we're on the site of what would have been known as Bridgie Walsh's.
Bridgie used to sell half cigarettes to the boys. She also sold paraffin from a 50-gallon drum.
And she didn't see any difficulty, with schoolboys lighting matches, smoking cigarettes beside this sort of time bomb of paraffin oil.